Hey everyone, welcome to the Kelly Writers House. I'm Julia Block, I'm the director of the Creative Writing Program, and I've been kind of dreaming of this panel for a really, really long time. I'm not going to introduce the panel, but I'm just going to say really quickly how proud and thrilled we are to host a conversation about speculative fiction. And I'm especially excited to hear what our panelists and our moderator have to say about the transgressive possibilities that open up within the genres of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, which have long been sites of really important and vital cultural production. If you're new to the Kelly Writers House, please grab a calendar of events on your way back out of here. We do have books for sale. I don't actually know which ones, but I saw someone with a stack of what looked like books out there. So please grab books after the event. Please help yourself to more food. If you get hungry during the conversation, please don't be shy about getting up and going out and getting more food and bringing it back in with you. Here, we're quite informal and quite open. So I am going to hand it over to Carmen Machado, who is artist in residence here at Penn, who teaches a number of wildly popular courses in speculative fiction, and who's going to be convening our conversation today. So thank you, Carmen.
Hello, everyone. I've also been very excited about this panel because these are some of my favorite genre writers working today, and they all got to come down from New York and visit us here. So I just wanted to introduce the panel over here. We have, at the very end, Alice Sola Kim. Alice lives in New York. Her writing has appeared in McSweeney's, Tin House, BuzzFeed Reader, Lightspeed, The Village Voice, and Lenny, and she won the 2016 Whiting Award. I've been obsessed with Alice's dark, sinewy, gorgeous writing for years and years and years in kind of a weird way, but now we're friends, so it's not weird anymore. And we recently spent a not insignificant amount of time talking about the literature of zit popping, which is a thing we're both very interested in. Next we have, now I have Havana in my head and I can't get it out. Maria Dahvana Headley, who is the #1 New York Times bestselling author and editor, most recently of the novels Magonia, Airy, Queen of Kings, and the internationally bestselling memoir The Year of Yes. Her work has appeared in Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, has been a finalist for the Nebula and Shirley Jackson Awards, and she has an upcoming book, The Mere Wife, a contemporary novel adaptation of Beowulf from FSG, and a short story collection from FSG, and The Combustible, a queer superhero novel from HarperCollins. She is a writer and fashion icon and is glamorous and fearless in both those things. Next we have Lara Elena Donnelly. She is the author of the glam spy thriller Amberlough, which is for sale out there, and its forthcoming sequels, Armistice and Amnesty. Lara is a Clarion graduate and was in fact in my Clarion class with me, as was Sam J. Miller. Her work has appeared in Strange Horizons, Escape Pod, Nightmare, and Uncanny. And she is one of the dapperest humans alive, and is my favorite hedonist in the entire world. And Sam J. Miller, here to my right, is a writer and community organizer. His debut novel, The Art of Starving, was published by HarperCollins in 2017. It's also for sale out there, and is to be followed by Blackfish City from Echo Press in 2018. His stories have been nominated for the Nebula, World Fantasy, and Theodore Sturgeon Awards, and have appeared in over a dozen years' best anthologies. He's also a graduate of the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop and the winner of the Shirley Jackson Award, and lives in New York. And his writing, like his dedication to his work and his life, is unrelenting and ferocious. So to sort of start off this panel, I wanted to have each of you talk about what I call your journey to speculative fiction, which may be not even the right way you might characterize it, but I wanted you to sort of talk about your relationship with non-realism and genre work sort of throughout your life and how it sort of led to your current careers. And that can be I guess we could start with Sam.
Okay. So I've always loved horror and science fiction and fantasy, and I've always read it and I've always written it. But I had also for a really long time sort of thought of it as one type of writing, and that there were other types of writing, like more conventional, realistic, or literary fiction that you use for other things, right? So that you might use science fiction or horror to write about certain parts of the human experience, but that if you wanted to get serious and emotional and do the really deep kind of character development and be real heavy and meaningful, you would use literary fiction. And so for me, the journey to speculative fiction, the moment where I unlocked the avatar state and managed to realize that those weren't separate things was when I read Ted Chiang's The Story of Your Life. And that was when I realized that you could write fucking brilliant science fiction that is smart and powerful and amazing and mind-blowing and also tell a story that makes you cry. Not that science fiction had never made me cry before, but I had never seen those two things done at such a high, sophisticated level, and that totally changed my life and changed my writing and really sort of got me out of that box that I had, that we all sort of we might deny it, but there might be a part of our brains where we think, oh, well, science fiction is one thing and it's somehow less than or different from non-genre writing. And so, that's when I went to Clarion, was because Ted Chiang was teaching at Clarion, and that's when I met awesome writers and became halfway decent.
I'm sure that you were more than halfway decent long before that. I, like Sam, started reading science fiction and fantasy first. I don't know, when I was little, that was all I would read, and that was pretty much all I read up through college. Even when I was assigned other things to read, I'd be like, oh, this is boring. And have actually sort of come through to the other side of now I read a lot of old weird literature. I've read a bunch of stuff from the 30s that is not science fiction in any way, but because I have that basis of reading genre fiction, I read everything now almost as if I expect it to be a genre story. And I've started writing stuff that is not speculative, but I found that I write it as if it is speculative anyway, and it's sort of become a way of looking at how. It's like a way of crafting a story where it makes the story feel as though anything is possible. So my debut novel came out and it's marketed as fantasy, but there's no magic in it. It's just an invented world. But I couldn't have written it as historical fiction, I don't think, because it felt like a straitjacket, right? So I think that grounding in worlds where there could be dragons, there could be magic, there's artificial intelligence, then you begin to approach everything that you create as I could do whatever I want and you can't stop me.
I just got lost in that and then forgot what I was ever. I'm my own journey. I don't know. I came at this in a way that I know several other people who have come to writing this way, left turn, left turn, left turn, left turn, and suddenly you're people are oh, it's a fantasy novel. But I started out as a playwright, and I was always a reader of everything. And in theater, of course, there's often, it's allegedly naturalistic, but it's not, because it's a scene, and it's all dialogue, and all the action is happening in dialogue in ways that doesn't happen in life. So I had years and years of creating worlds that were made entirely out of words. And then I wrote a memoir that was a long monologue about my dating life in New York. It was my first book. And everyone said, that's really weird and fantastical. And it was just my life. And I kept trying to say that I was a person who was writing things that were just her experience of the world. And at a certain point, people believed that I was a fantasy writer. And I believe that I am just a normal writer. I think we all imagine the entirety of universes when we write. Might often have magic in them, but they would have magic in them if I was just telling you a story about the subway. So throughout this left-turny career, I ended up writing historical fiction about Cleopatra that had monsters and gods in the gaps in the history. And again, that seems perfectly normal to me in a classical structure, because all of classical literature, it's all full of monsters and gods, as is the history frequently. The people who are involved are often the children of gods, the historical figures. Caesar's I come from a line of gods. And Cleopatra too. So it's it's interesting to be adapting Beowulf. I've been adapting this Meerwife book for FSG for the last year, and it's Beowulf. It's Beowulf in the suburbs, but it's the closest to normal life that I think I've ever gotten, and it has monsters and dragons, but it's a novel about suburbia. It's like a Richard Yates novel mixed with Beowulf. Yeah.
I love that description. I guess I always loved fantasy and science fiction and horror. And I know that as children, we often get to read a lot more of that and then are gradually kind of pushed away from that, which I think is sad, and hopefully is happening less. And, hopefully in college, you're allowed to write what you want as opposed to there being a restriction on genre. So for me, I think I just always read anything I wanted without differentiating between any of it. So I was very lucky in that sense. And another thing that helped me with that was movies. Like I loved science fiction and fantasy film the most. And, I was with some people the other day and they were talking about the movies they loved when they were kids, like Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, Willow. And they asked me and I said, Terminator 1 and 2, because that's another thing I think that probably put me on this path to being like underparented or strangely parented, in the sense that like I felt like I had access to anything and everything. I would go to the library and I would go to, the science fiction section and just start with the A's and just kind of work my way through it. Like nobody told me what I was supposed to do, and I think that was a great help for me. And then continuing on in college, which is when I started writing, I took my first writing workshop. I was really lucky to have a professor who did not say, there couldn't be vampires or ghosts or anything like that. And what I wrote was this weird story about going to college, but also like there were like mutant things running around biting you, stuff like that. It was just immediately like what came out. And I think to some extent, like we can try all of these things with our writing. We can copy people. We can try to make ourselves more of a this writer than a that. But like ultimately it just comes out however it's going to come out. That's why I don't feel too weird when I get that copying or imitation urge, because I know like it will just kind of disappear. Like it'll just sound like me in the end, and something interesting will have happened with my thought process in between, but you won't see it. So yeah, end there.
Excellent. So I was going to sort of put this off till closer to the end, but I think I'm just going to do it right now because I think it's really important. So Lara, Amberlough addresses fascism. Sam, your forthcoming novel is set in a future of climate change, and you've all written about illness, queerness, gender, gentrification, race, and I want to know how you think speculative fiction addresses our contemporary political state. I mean, to answer that how you will.
So, one answer is that in real life you can't kill the monsters, but in horror you can, right? You can take all the things that terrify you and upset you, and you can put them into a monster who you can then kill. If there's in contemporary politics, if there's somebody you don't like, you can't kill them. And if there's
you can, but you shouldn't.
You shouldn't.
Right.
Just if anyone's listening, you shouldn't do that. Certainly not arguing for that. But no, there's sort of like, and even if you did kill them, right? There's like, they didn't come from nowhere. They came from like existential, societal, systemic power imbalances that make that. Make it a really smart thing to be a monster because, people love monsters and whatever. So yeah, the world is fucked up and horrible, and at least in a horror story you can say that and then put it all into something that can be addressed, can be dealt with, can be reckoned with, can be understood, and where the sort of power that we have as individuals that often in real life doesn't feel like a lot of power can feel more balanced and more like you have a chance and that you matter.
So while Sam was talking, I had this like, oh, I hope he's going to mention the Toastmaster speech from the World Fantasy Awards this year, because it was called something like Digging Up the Future or Uncovering the Future, and it was basically a speech about how and why like stories, specifically speculative stories, are important in a climate of like historical revisionism or like suppression, and that writing stories of what you need to see or want to see and being able to kill a monster is like is like incredibly hopeful. And there was an essay in Uncanny this month. Did you read it? Did you? Okay, so there's an essay in Uncanny this month by a Filipino writer who was writing about the political situation in the Philippines, and it started out as like a very straightforward sort of like, should I leave? I feel like I have work still to do, but I'm so exhausted from staring horror in the face every day. And then it turned into this like ode to reading science fiction and reading fantasy and like having watched some horrible story in the news about the murder of a teenager, and then the only way to cope with this was to go watch Return of the King, because at the end of Return of the King, like, the world is saved. And it was something that let this writer push one more day, like knowing that, you know, some small person who doesn't necessarily feel like they can affect change in the world, like in this instance they could, and even if there's not a magical ring to throw in a volcano in their life, like in the writer's life, at least they can see someone else do it. And it was a really, really powerful essay that was grounded very firmly in like, this is a real problem that this person is facing, and the way that they are getting through it is that they are consuming large amounts of science fiction and fantasy. And it was a really fantastic, I don't know, I left it feeling like I had been feeling like, what am I doing working on a novel right now? I should be like calling my senator. But like I left that essay being like, oh, I don't actually feel bad. I mean, I'm still going to call my senator, but like, I don't feel like racked with guilt that I'm wasting my time on writing a fantasy novel. Like, hopefully someone will read it, especially since it's about like an anti-fascist dynamite person who's like going and blowing stuff up. Like, hopefully someone will read it and they'll come away from that being like, yeah,
I can blow stuff up.
I can blow stuff up. Yeah, like, don't actually, but like.
Or I actually was going to bring up the Toastmaster speech. It was Martha Wells at World Fantasy talking about secret histories, and it was she was basically saying everything has a secret history. Just peel back the like structure that says basically the structure of the patriarchy. She was saying, get rid of the patriarchy, and there are all of these stories that you've never heard before. And one of the things that I think has been useful in the sort of writing things that have fantastical elements, which again, as I say, I don't really see them as fantastical, but I wrote a novel called Magonia, which is a young adult novel.
Which is amazing.
Thank you. And in that novel, there's a sky kingdom, and it's based in French folklore, this idea of ships floating around in the sky. So like old school, like 7th, 8th century, the history of an idea of a world above us that is not necessarily a god world, but just a like working class world that is full of people trying to deal with fishing and dealing with, and we're the fish. And we are also, so it's like early alien lore, it's early climate lore about crops, about crop thieving. And one of the things that I put into that novel that isn't what the novel is about, in theory, is that all of the captains in Magonia are women, and I just don't talk about it. I'm like, yeah, you know, that obviously that's how it is. And one of the privileges of writing things that are in the fantastical realm is that I can get rid of the patriarchy, and see what happens. And what happens is that you have it's just like a normal world in which everyone has equality. It's nice, and that is theoretically that's utopian, but I think it's a utopia that doesn't fuck anyone, which is really unusual. Usually there's like the dystopic underbelly of the utopia. And in this case, it's such to have the privilege to make a world, especially as this book is for teenage readers, to make a world that doesn't have, that isn't broken in that particular way that we've all been raised to accept it to be broken. And to say, it doesn't have to be like this. This is, but not even have that be the revolution in the book. The revolution isn't women taking power. It's just that the power has always been there for them. And when I talk to my baby readers, when we're talking about like how it changes the world, like this is the joy. Like after the election, I was on book tour. I was on book tour through the election, talking to teenagers in Texas and Florida, and I was roaming and barely dealing. And I had like 14-year-olds in my audience, and lots of queer 14-year-olds, lots of kids of color, lots of kids who were like first generation. And I have a badass audience for this book. This is the dream. This is what you want. And they are all coming the fuck up. So like, I get to help raise them. I get to help raise the next generation of voters with a utopian vision of what I think should not be utopia, which is equality. And I get to, and it's fantasy, whatever. That's the power of tilting the world a little bit and saying, this is the fantastic possibility. We could have equality and just have stories about people who live fairly, sort of racial, patriarchal, all of this stuff. I basically equalize the shit. That's the joy. That's the joy of writing fantasy. I don't want it to be fantasy. I want it to be reality. So I think you can help make reality by raising your readers, right? Yeah.
I feel like there's a subcategory of genre writers who are really invested in maintaining those power structures while also having things like dragons, right? Where it's like, well, of course, like the women would be oppressed. Like, haven't you read history? And it's like, but there's literally dragons. Like, you can do whatever you want. And I feel like the other sort of side of that is like what you're talking about.
The way they make it feel real is by adding rape.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Like as though it's salt. Like, make that taste right. Fuck that.
Yeah.
Yeah. After the election, one of the things I thought was, please don't let Trump make us bad writers. And by that, I mean, I don't want all writers to feel pressured, to talk specifically, directly, baldly about politics in their writing. Like, fine if you are already that kind of writer, if you're drawn to that, if that's what you were doing, etc. But I guess I just really did not want anyone to feel that their voice was suddenly choked off, because because this had happened in the world, if you're writing intelligently and thoughtfully, if you're paying attention to the world around you and then just writing about something else altogether, say a new world that you've created, if you're doing all the things that you're supposed to do as a good writer, as a careful writer, like it will come through, right? Because everything touches everything. Everything is political, right? So that was kind of just another way I tried to tell myself that, because not everyone is like, George Orwell or whatever going to be that direct about it, but it will all be political and it will all help somebody, as Maria was talking about. The other thing is that I've just been so fucking mad for I guess since I was born, but just really, really mad, mad like a fire hose, except the opposite, because it's fire. Yeah, flamethrower, but a really thick one, right? So like a fire hose of a flamethrower. And I think about I've also been thinking about the Me Too hashtag, right? And all of these stories of people coming forward about sexual harassers and abusers. And in general, when I think about this kind of rage and I'm writing about it, there's also this question of how to make it artful. And it's not exactly for the reading audience, right? It's also for yourself. How does this become a story or a novel or something worth having and worth creating and something crafted? And I think that's where my love of speculative fiction comes in, because it does this thing where, it both turns reality strange, right? It defamiliarizes, and it also takes that which is imaginary, right, and tries to make it real. So I'm always very attracted to that push-pull. And I think that kind of thinking is especially valuable now and as we go on.
Yeah, Sam, that actually makes me think about your story, The Heat of Us, which is a story about Stonewall, but with a sort of speculative, the idea that the collective sort of not even the collective, but the rage and the joy of the people at Stonewall, like, created this sort of movement and uprising. So yeah, no, I think I love this idea of, like, because it's about this, like, sort of the space to, like, create utopia, but also the space to, like, be enraged in a way that, like, changes minds and it makes art. So I want to talk for a minute about novels and short stories. All of you publish both, except Alice, I know you're working on a novel. You have not published a novel, but you're sort of working on it. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. Sorry, I didn't mean to blow up your spot like that.
I will totally talk about it, but I'm dying. I feel like please help me, everybody.
You also don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. But I was wondering if you could talk about sort of in terms of, so speculative fiction, right, being the fictions of ideas, and, like, how that sort of works on both a short story and a novel level, and how you think that's different, and sort of if you think that they serve different purposes for you as a writer.
I mean, I love them both. I think that they both present really exciting and really fun opportunities and challenges. I think that usually with short stories, you can explore an idea really simply and briefly and be like, okay, what if, there was collective pyrokinesis, and you yourself might not have pyrokinesis, but by combining with others you could make fire happen. How might that play out? And so, or how might it be that hearing a song will allow you to travel in time back to a previous time that you heard the song? Sometimes you just have, like, a weird, spooky kind of, like, idea in your head that a short story is the proper venue to access, and that's really fun. And sometimes you have something that requires the kind of depth and digging that only a novel can do. But for me, the distinction, the what decides what will be what, is less the concept and the speculative conceit than the character and who they are and what their story is. And some characters need a novel to work through their shit. Some concerns can only really be addressed on that kind of scale, and other things where it's just like, okay, I just need to get in and get out, and this person has this one thing they need to get the fuck over, and I swear a lot when there's a microphone in front of me. I apologize. I don't know what that is. It's a really weird allergy that I have to microphones, I guess. Sometimes a short story is just the kind of way to respond, because that's who the character is and what the speculative conceit is. And also maybe it's just not that much fun and I just want to do it really briefly, as opposed to spending a whole novel talking about something.
Oh man, I feel like I function better as a novelist than a short story writer, just because I am so into, like, characters working through their shit, which is really hard in a short story. Like, it is I think a much better venue to inspect sort of like a premise. And historically in my writing, when I get a premise, if it doesn't immediately come along with, like, characters who are dealing with that premise, I can't do it. I'm like, what if X, Y, Z? And then I'm like, oh yeah, that'd be cool. And then I, like, wander away. I do the same thing with essays, where I'm like, I've had a thought about a piece of media. It's a very interesting thought. And now I'm satisfied. So which is why I don't write essays either. But with a novel, so I would continually for a long time write short stories, and people would critique them, and they'd be like, your character doesn't do anything, just stuff happens to them. And I think that was almost it was me needing more space for the character to deal with the stuff that was happening to them and then react to it. Whereas in a short story, they had just sort of, like, I'd put a bunch of stuff in, and then the character would be like, and in a novel, and, like, my novels run kind of long, right? So they're like 110,000 words, which I guess now is sort of the industry standard for a lot of fantasy novels. But like, a lot of people were telling me when I first started trying to shop a novel, like, 110,000 word debut novel, I don't know if anyone's going to read that. But really, like, that was how much space it took me to get the characters to grow and learn and move through some form of, like, an arc of character development. Sometimes short stories will work out, but I'm not as comfortable. I feel like they're too There's not enough room to stretch.
I'm recalibrating my understanding of everything as I listen to these answers, and I'm like, is it true for me too? Maybe I can fix myself. So I've been long. This is a perversity. I mention this short story on panels all the time, and I can never remember what it's actually called. I can only remember that it was in one story about 15 years ago. It's a story about a man who writes a history of his town and loses his way. He starts writing the history of the molecules of the town until he has like thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, which he's trying to publish as the book that he's been writing for years and years. And at some point, someone says, maybe it should be shorter. And he starts to cut. And he cuts it and cuts it and cuts it. It's as satisfying as writing it. He's like getting it down to the really, the most distilled version until finally he has a haiku. And he's like, well, this is what it is. It's that's the history of the town as a haiku. So when I write a short story versus a novel, I feel that's exactly what I feel like I'm doing. I feel like with a short story, it's like just the skeleton, but the skeleton can be so impactful. You can make those bones so interesting, but you're not going to add flesh to it. And that means that you can tell the history of humanity in a short story, which is without writing 40,000 words or 100,000 words or whatever. And I think that's my short stories often have like, here are 6 paragraphs where we go through the history of the 20th century with just like the important bones of it for this story. And that I find that very satisfying. It's also something that I struggle with because it's something I like to do too much. And every time I do it, I'm like, I've never done that before. This is a new thing that I have never done. And no one has ever seen such a method. And I'm like glowing and satisfied. And then I read 2 of my stories and they're exactly the same. Because I have an idea that maybe if I just like pan out and look out at humanity from above at the end of the short story, we can all feel very satisfied. But with a novel, it's like all of the fat and all of the lumps. And I find that when I add the body to the novel, actually usually what happens is that I write the body first, and the body, all of the skin and bones and the bones aren't there. Actually, I just don't write the bones. I tend to write a big pile of body. And then I have to forcibly insert skeleton in the second evil draft. And the whole time I feel that I am dying because I'm shoving a spine through a mountain of flesh.
This is the best image.
It's a really speculative image, but it is exactly the nasty nature of novel writing for me. It's like, oh God, now I've invented the universe and I have to make it make sense. And I find that I have not found a way to not do that. I haven't found a way to write the skeleton, though for my short stories, I can obviously, that's exactly what I do for my short stories. For a novel, I'm just like, luscious details. Ooh, we're going to be here in a long description of a doorknob. And I forgot to build a house, like, at the end. I just have a fucking doorknob. So, yeah, they're really different, but I have the same problem, obviously, and I am a Gemini, and so I'm testing both extreme edges of problems.
Just doorknobs and flesh. Giant pile of it.
It's like Akira, just like,
Sounds pretty great. Yeah, short stories, which are what I've published and not a novel yet, hopefully. I love the sense of play, the sense that you can just try anything, everything, and you can kind of get over that hump of self-loathing that we all have when we're writing more easily because you're just like, well, if it doesn't work, then it's just a short story draft that doesn't work or something like that. And you can just feel yourself getting really like seduced and dazzled by an idea or a character or situation. And you can feel that kind of love and sense of like bedazzlement through the whole time you're writing because you can just kind of zoom in or zoom out as much as you want. Like you have that choice and that sense of control. Which in a novel, it totally disappears, right? Because you're just like, oh, the longer I talk about this thing, the more like shitty it is. And this is actually terrible. what was I saying? So
We're all just lost in horror right
now. So
now.
I think another thing is I tend to be this is very personal, I tend to be very bingey as a writer, or I was. There was something really lovely and like kind of like a weird methy dream like state, right, where you could just write a story in like a day, or a few days. There's something beautiful about that too, because you keep that world in your head. You're able to like just imagine it kind of whole and keep that connection for that amount of time. And that's something I find harder with a novel, just keeping that connection there, because if you lose it somehow, I think it takes a little while to return to it. So I'm not really dying. I think it's going well, actually. I'm almost done, but there were all these things I just felt I had to relearn and do completely differently, while still understanding that I don't have to completely change as a writer. I was talking to Maria beforehand about being a bingey writer, and then how you can be a bingey novelist without like kind of dropping dead after one day, right? After trying to write a novel in a day. There's still things you can do in your process that you can import, I guess.
You can also write a novel in 2 weeks. It's possible, I promise. It's a good binge.
Alice, I feel like I remember reading, like, it was Ray Bradbury or somebody who talked about writing short stories in a day. And he did it, I think, because he was, like, renting a typewriter. He was, like, feeding his family with his short stories. He was, like, renting a typewriter and, like, just wildly writing stories. And then, like, they'd be out. And that's also, I think it's like a really, like, interesting idea that, like, the world is, like, contained in you. So you can sort of, like, access it in that way.
Yeah, it's so much easier. But there are good things about the novel, right? Like, so like relationships I found, like you were saying, Lara, like that is so much more easy and fun to do and so much richer. Because relationships develop over time, and time is what you have in the novel. So that's fun.
So I want to open up the discussion to questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question? Oh, and we have a microphone, so raise your hand nice and tall. Oh, yes, we have one over there.
Hi. I had a quick question, more so about science fiction than fantasy fiction, but I guess speculative fiction in general. It's almost not common, but it occurs in science fiction where authors such as like Larry Nevin with Ringworld will write science fiction stories using like a new fangled theory of science that kind of expands it, and then a few years down the road, that sort of speculative vision of the theory becomes like scientific fact. So I guess my question for everyone is, I guess, what is the place of speculative fiction in speculations of fact? Kind of, is it the intermediary step between it being completely fantastical and it being kind of accepted as scientific or as kind of realistic fact in a way?
I mean, I just wrote a science fiction novel that's coming out in April. It's called Blackfish City, so I'll give it a shot and say that for me personally, I run screaming away from any attempt to try to be factual or accurate or show my work or have decent scientific grounding for my stuff, just because I know that often when I'm reading science fiction, especially older science fiction, I can totally tell when somebody was trying to be super scientific, and that's usually where it flops, right? Because they were trying to say, this is what the future is going to look like, and then the future doesn't look anything like that. And then you as a reader are taken out of it to be like, ha ha ha, how naive this writer was, or how inaccurate that was. And there was a William Gibson quote where he's writing about writing Neuromancer, which is sort of like coined the term cyberspace and is sort of this really compelling and powerful vision of the future. And said that he knew nothing about the internet or anything related to technology or computers at this time, that he's writing about a world where we can live inside computers and go into simulated virtual spaces. And the only thing he knew about was modems. So he wrote a lot about modems, and you're just reading these segments, and it's the only part of the novel where you're like, yeah, you got that part, and that's not so relevant. So I'm less concerned about like what's the science going to look like, and more concerned with how are people going to live with it. Like if there's a technology where you can have like a subdermal implant that will allow for real-time translation of most languages, how's that going to feel as a person? How are you gonna live that, as opposed to how's it gonna work? Like, what's the technology of it? How does that happen?
You don't know how your phone works. Like, I don't know. I was thinking about this on the way here, actually. I was like, how does a car work? And then I ended up like comparing it to my novel, because I'm writing a novel, like I'm on deadline writing a novel right now, which is probably why I was like, how do cars and novel? But like from like, I know that there's an engine, right? And you put gasoline in it and it makes the wheels turn, right? But there's this whole part in the middle that I was like, I know there's like a turny, like there's a belt. And then I was like, oh, my book is like that, because I know how it starts and I know how it ends, but like I'm not really sure how all the moving parts function together. That's not the answer I was going to give to your question. I'm drinking coffee on this panel. So Ted Chiang at Clarion yelled at me, and he didn't yell at me because he's Ted, so he was like, well, actually, because I was reading his collection, Story of Your Life and Others, and it's all like, he writes amazing science fiction stories based in like current scientific theory, usually. But then there's this one story in there that's like, there are golems and clockwork, and it on the surface appears very like Victoriana, steampunky, like definitely not science fiction. And I was like, Ted, that steampunk fantasy story you wrote, that seemed really out of character. And he was like, well, it actually, follows my personal definition of science fiction, which is whatever, you take one known fact and you flip it, and then you rigorously interrogate all of the consequences of like, what if this thing was different? Or like, what if this technology existed? How would people live with it? How would it affect how we interact with the world? So like this thing which I called steampunk, he called pretty much like hard science fiction, because it was in Victorian times, or it was slightly earlier, because they were talking about spontaneous generation, in which he was like, spontaneous generation is real, right? In this world, what if spontaneous generation was real? This is what falls out from that. And I was chastened because he's Ted Chiang and a genius.
I was talking to Nicola Griffith about this. Nicola is an amazing writer who wrote, she's written lots of science fiction novels, but also a novel set in the rising of a woman who will become a saint, an abbess named Hild, which came out a couple of years ago. So it's like, that's deep historical fiction interrogating everything about what it would be like to be in the, I think it's set in the 6th century. Really deep research, in the same way that her scientific research always is as well. She in one of her books, which I think is called, it might be Slow River, she basically invents an iPad, and I think that book came out in like 95 or so. And she invented, it's interesting to be someone who's inventing technology that actually fucks with your plot. Like, the technology makes it so you, it's like having a phone in a story. Like, once you have a phone in a story, people can call for help once you have a cell phone. And so, like, all the problem of writing horror right now is that you have to make sure no one has a phone because they can't have a map. And I think that talking with Nicola about this, is the idea of like making a world where indeed you have those maps, but still human problems are human problems. And writing science fiction that works in the long term, you're thinking about what is the nature of human? What is the nature, or not necessarily, I mean, sometimes it's aliens in your science fiction, but like, I believe that aliens, I'm like, why is that not a fantasy novel? It's an alien. But the nature of generally it's about the nature of wrongful interactions, whether or not you have conveniences, whether or not you have glorious technological or scientific revelations. It's still about like, what are the guts of the problem of being this person who has to interact with other people, or this robot who has to interact with people, or this robot who has to interact with other robots? What are the gut problems of that? Where are they? And they're always kind of the same problems. The problem of wanting hierarchical superiority is always the problem, right? The problem of wanting to be on top is almost always the problem in these stories. And so I feel like as long as you get the nature of that correctly, sometimes it feels dated if you're like deep in the technology and deep in the science, but the idea of the profound inconvenience of being a person with emotions and the profound inconvenience of being a thing that bleeds is, and a thing, however you bleed, whether you're rusting and it's the Wizard of Oz, or whether you're bleeding because, you're like losing your battery source. Like I think it's all the same. If you get the distress of it right, you're still viable a century later. Like there are the things like, Frankenstein.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in agreement with everybody. And what I'm going to say is just going to follow from what they said. The main issue I have, I think, with a lot of this very future forecasty hard science fiction is that like it always seems to come with this very bossy presupposition that everything will just go to plan. Like the author will have this idea of how things will be and this technology which will be like this, and people will react to it exactly like so. And that's just not how it goes. Like there's another William Gibson quote, right, which is generally the street finds its own uses for things. And I think like that right there is one of the things that kind of stymies, especially like a fiction writer's attempt to tell the future, right? People come in with their own motivations. People come in wanting to fuck things up or improve them somehow. People do things the way they're not supposed to. So, yeah, no telling the future.
Thanks. Hey, this is kind of a reverse. I want to talk about the past instead of the future. I'm just trying to think how to put this question. It seems to me a lot of speculative fiction, while it imagines new or alternate realities, also goes back to recognizable elements from other stories or other storytelling traditions. Like, like a vampire existed before the vampire story you wrote. Or like I'm interested in like your use of Beowulf in your new novel, that kind of reach into the past to use that stuff to create something new. So I guess I'm just generally asking, how often do you guys reach into the past like that? What kind of move is it? Is it a purposefully subversive move? Is it, do you ever feel the need to sort of remedy something or save something from its own history? I think there's a lot of different ways in relationships, and I know it's not that simple, but I'm just asking, I guess, for some general thoughts on that.
Well, here comes the sales pitch. Lara and I just co-wrote a story called Making Us Monsters, which is in Uncanny Magazine and available online, which is we wrote an epistolary novelette between Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, who were two poets in World War I. They were both gay men, and they were lovers, and it imagines a correspondence between them decades after Wilfred Owen died in the trenches. And I think, so for me, what was really exciting about writing this story was this opportunity to sort of go back to the past and really reclaim queer history, right? And, even though it's sort of very apparent, I think, that they were gay, and both of them sort of said as much, and it's very clear if you read them that that's what was going on, they're also some of the most celebrated poets of World War I and sort of huge British poetry icons. So people are very resistant to the idea of acknowledging that they are gay, and even some of the reviews that we've gotten for the story have been like, this story alleges that, or exaggerates their relationship. So there is this sort of subversive value to sort of looking at the past and saying, it really wasn't, you're fucking wrong. And I think that sort of goes in hand with what Maria was saying about sort of being able to imagine a world where the rules that we think of, the patriarchy, whatever, aren't present. And so that is very exciting, and one way that I've used the past recently.
Yeah. That story, by the way, is one of the pieces of writing that I've done that I'm most proud of. So I would be honored if you would all read it. So I have a friend who's a playwright who writes a lot of plays that are set all sort of throughout history. She just did a one-woman show called The Queer Musings of Miss Mary Bennett, in which she played Mary Bennett, who had always known she was a lesbian but had no word for it. And it's just a show of her talking through these things about herself she doesn't understand because she doesn't have the community that can help her understand them. And sort of the play ends with this amazing reveal. It's probably not going to be produced again soon, so I'm just going to spoil it for you. She's waiting for a man who she's fairly certain is going to propose marriage, right? And she's so excited to escape her parents' house because this was one of the few ways that a woman could escape caring for her aging parents and living the rest of her life a spinster. She's very excited to get out from under her like crazy nervous mother's thumb and her disapproving cold father. And she's not like, she likes the guy, but she's like, I don't know, something about it just doesn't feel right. And when he comes to propose, she turns him down because she decided she just can't do it. And then he's like, no, I don't I feel the same way about you that you feel about me. And she like doesn't get it. And it finally comes out. He's like, I like men. Like I like men like you like women. We're going to have a marriage of convenience. And I'm going to introduce you to all the people who are like you because you're not alone. Because it was true that like a lesbian in the Regency England would not have been alone. There would have been a lot of other lesbians. And like Martha Wells says in her Toastmaster speech, like, the rules have just closed the book on that. Oh God, I can't remember the women of. There's like so many stories about people living that kind of life. Like I'm gonna marry my girlfriend and live in a castle in Wales, even though it's the 1500s. Like people did that, and one of the fun things, it's like you said something about saving the past from itself, or like it's more like saving the past from us. Yeah, and also just aesthetics. I mean that's my reason for writing the past. It was pretty. It was pretty.
I do a lot of work that grabs from the past. Most of my work is rooted in some little fact or bit of information that I grabbed up and thought, there's more to that. That's what if. What if this was the whole story? What if this little piece that's in the footnotes was the whole thing this book was about, or this whatever. I view the past as, for me, it's like a dumpster dive, but it's a dumpster dive into a dumpster the size of the Grand Canyon, and it's full of ships and female captains and jewels that could control the universe, and also a lot of garbage. It's full of all of the garbage, but I think that a lot of the tradition of storytelling and what has been lauded in terms of story is really just the foam at the top of the cup, And I'm like, all right, well, there's that story. But then underneath, if you just go deeper and you go deeper, and to write stuff that's rooted in historical research or that grabs from historical research is an opportunity to go deeper and get dirty in something that is usually really complicated and interesting, like doing this Beowulf thing, which meant that I read all of the translations of Beowulf that I could. So I've read 14, and they're all they're like Victorian. They're going up through the 20th century, but beginning with the early ones that like fucked everything up with the mistranslation that says that Grendel's mother is a monster, and that got accepted. But it's the same word. It's Beowulf, Grendel's mother, and Grendel, and it's one word. And for him, it's translated as hero in the original sort of academically used translation of Beowulf. And for them, it's translated as monster or hag. So, and that changes that story a little bit, right? If Grendel's mother is a veteran, if she's a soldier and not a monster, that is a completely different story. And sometimes it's that simple. I mean, that's what my book is about. It's about a veteran. Grendel's mother's a vet, who's butting up against suburban culture, and Beowulf is a policeman. But I think that it's often so easy to go into a little bit of historical research and you find something that got wrong and it stayed wrong and it was acceptable according to story standards, which say the man is the hero and the men are heroes. And then you look at it a little closer and you're like, no, that's actually a mistranslation. The man is a monster. If they're all monsters or they're all heroes. And I mean, that's a very different story. I did a novelette. I don't remember. It's called What There Was to See about corneal transplants, and it's about the history of corneal transplants, which I wrongfully learned all about. But the history is that the first human corneal transplant was on a woman. No one knows her name. She was a teenage girl. She got rabbit corneas. And the doctor that gave her the rabbit corneas then traveled around Europe, like displaying her as his successful. But, you know, it's like her history isn't written. There is no written history of her. So I had to like climb around in the history, getting all of the accounts of what the shit he said, which is him saying, I'm a hero, I'm a scientific genius, I got these rabbit eyeballs and now they're hers. And it worked. But there's no history beyond the 6 month to a year period after which she receives the rabbit eyeballs. And there's no story. So to write the story of someone who's seeing through the eyes of a rabbit is for me the interesting part of the story. And also someone who is a miracle. And usually the history of the person who is the miracle is almost never written. And that's what the history of other people experiencing the miraculous and being like, miraculous is weird and I want to kill it or I want to worship it. We have so much history of that. We have so much history of the like negative edges of the story, in my opinion, but not of what I think the central story often should be. So the historical research can fill in. It can fill in either place. It can fill in the negative edges. It can fill in the middle, and you end up with 65 other interesting chunks of story that were not documented because the structural history of humanity says those aren't real stories.
I guess I might be realizing this for the first time, sitting here, listening to everyone's interesting responses. But I think I'm allergic to the past. I don't even go to thrift stores or anything. But and I think it's just a wildly fascinating and valuable, just overall really interesting and important project, right? To generally reclaim, revise, reimagine the past in literature. And I love reading that stuff. But for some reason, I do not currently write about that at all, and I'm not really interested in doing so. And I think part of the reason is probably just weird and personal, but I'm sure some of it just has to, maybe also has to do with the fact that, I'm from an immigrant family, and I think you can go one of two ways, right? Like the past is just so fascinating to you because you don't know what yours is. And for me, I don't know my grandparents' names or what they did. I never met them, and so on and so forth. So that never became something that I felt like I could explore or even thought about. And I think that happens to a lot of people, but then they go one way or the other.
So I wanted to ask a question. I guess, on one hand, I'm really happy to be alive at this moment when it seems like a lot of the boundaries between genres and everything are being broken down in a way where I think a lot of writers just kind of see them as arbitrary now, and so they feel free to write literary fiction that uses some of the conventions of what we would think of as sci-fi and everything. But at the same time, I guess it's created this problem, as I see it, of how do you kind of assess value? Because I feel 50 years ago or whatever, I feel like there was basically this scheme where okay, there's going to be high art and low art, right? And we're going to stick all this stuff like horror and sci-fi, we're going to put that as low art just because of the subject matter that the author chose. Whereas high art is going to be reserved for I don't know, domestic dramas or something, just ordinary sort of realist literary fiction subject matter. Nowadays, that's not really the case because over the 20th century, you have writers you have people who are genre writers who try to expand the boundaries of what they're writing about and write really smart fiction like Octavia Butler or Philip K. Dick and those people. And then at the same time, you have literary fiction writers, quote unquote, who were writing stuff like Cormac McCarthy would write Blood Meridian, and that's on the surface it's a Western, right? But it's a really deeper, I don't know, I guess type of fiction than your ordinary Western would be. So I guess it's kind of this thing nowadays where subject matter isn't really the defining attribute you use to assess value in that way. And so I guess nowadays how do you assess writers who kind of mix and match boundaries, and like what do you use as sort of the litmus test of determining like where there's value and where isn't there? Or do you kind of just I mean, I know some people say like what's the point of assessing value anyway in literature like that, but I don't know, I still feel like it's kind of important in a way, because if you say it doesn't matter, then you have to put like everything on the same pedestal, which doesn't really make sense, because there is still bad stuff out there. So I guess how do you guys, like, when you're assessing authors, whether they're writing kind of more speculative fiction stuff, or like more realist stuff, how do you assess value in that way if like subject matter doesn't seem like the defining thing to go by anymore?
I don't know if this is inappropriate or not, but I kind of want to hear what Carmen has to say about this.
Yeah. I actually heard Carmen say some really smart stuff about this at an event a couple weeks ago.
Oh God. I don't want to say too much. So I'm the moderator. I don't have to do that. But
Turning the table.
It's okay because we asked him.
I yield my time. reclaim your time, Carmen.
I feel like for me the answer, like there's art that changes your temperature and art that doesn't change your temperature. And if it changes your temperature, I think it has value. And if it doesn't change your temperature, it might not have value. It might have value to somebody else, but it won't necessarily have value to you. And I think that is a really, and it's not easy, but I mean, I feel like that sense of, sometimes you consume art and you're like, whatever. Like you read a book, you're like, that was a book. It had words. You see a movie, you're like, it probably cost a lot of money to make. Ooh. You know, but there's no resonance. There's no like, there's nothing. Its ghost didn't touch your ghost. You know. So I feel like that is a way. I mean, obviously, there's like larger questions of like cultural value, and like obviously, there's always going to be like people who prioritize certain kinds of narratives over others, and certain artists over others for all kinds of really weird reasons. But yeah, I think you have to make your own sort of individual assessment of art, and does it change your temperature? But now I want to hear what all y'all have to say. or any if you don't, if one.
I think I have something to say about that. I was talking with my friend Craig this morning about a variety of things, but about the way that I always say art isn't necessarily good. Like it doesn't necessarily have a good impact. Like you can make art that is then. We were talking about the embrace of sort of high fantasy by white nationalists. The idea that story is a story that they want to be true. They want it to be a story where the rulers are them. and still those things are often also taken by people who are more politically my speed as like, wow, that guy invented a whole world, and it's interesting art that he invented a world. And we value it for its imaginary heft, but not necessarily for its reinforcement of cultural fables. And the same thing is true with like Cormac McCarthy, in my opinion. I feel like his books are certainly art. They are poetic. They have heft, but they are also. I feel they also really, really reinforce misogynist fables, and they do it so articulately that I find them to be they scare me. I don't like them to be heralded as hefty, viable art. I want them, even though I see him as a skilled writer and a really kick-ass writer in many ways, I also see him articulately mansplaining. So like, what is art? You know, like we talk about genre all the time this way. We talk about like sword and sorcery and like all of the categories of genre for people who write genre are pretty delineated. And then if you're someone who writes weird shit, like everyone on this panel, sometimes you're on a panel with with people who don't do that. People who are like, I do the by the numbers version of this kind of book. And then you're on a panel and they're like, you asshole, you stole my toys. Like you're using my toys and you're calling them art. And you're fancy now. And I think there's room for both. But I think it is a worthwhile conversation about validity to discuss, to break it down into the haiku on every level, to break the art down into the haiku, to break the like fancy down into the haiku, to say this is what this story is actually about, regardless of the skill. And then we can talk about whether the art quote is impactful in any kind of useful societal fashion. If you're someone who cares about that, like, not everybody cares. Somebody are like entertainment only, but entertainment is impactful in society, obviously. So I think it's a thing that when I'm assessing what is good, I'm like, break it down into the one line and see what this thing is about. I don't care if it's beautiful, because it might be. I think it also might be evil. And I want to think about my own capacity to make evil by accident, because I think that's how a lot of evil happens, is accidental evil. Also purposeful evil, but accidental evil as a storyteller is real.
I just want to say a thing about this that is not necessarily about art, but about marketing, right? I think that division of high and low art is still something that publishers use as a marketing tool. So there's a bookstore in New York called Book Culture that I love because they don't have a fantasy and science fiction section and a literature section. They only have a literature section. All the speculative fiction is there, and it's mixed in just by author name, right? And I went to buy a book the other day, and I was like, ooh, I have been looking for David Mitchell's Slade House, but I haven't bought it because I'm a cheapskate. Here it is for $7. And I took it off the shelf, and while I was sort of looking through the David Mitchell books, there was a blurb that was like, this book is incredible. I don't remember if it was Bone Clocks or Slade House, but it was like, David Mitchell is showing us what books can do. As if, like, no one had ever written a haunted house story before, right? But because David Mitchell is marketed as high art for discerning people, and if you read, like, and then it was made into, like, and then Cloud Atlas, which was, like, high art for discerning people, was made into, like, a ridiculous CGI movie, which I haven't seen, but Sam says is very good. But, like, I wouldn't necessarily say that the movie that was made out of Cloud Atlas, like, if you were a discerning person who consumes high art, you might be like, Hollywood has turned this discerning high art into, like, a thing. Whereas, like, people are on the other side of that divide who are writing stuff that is as beautiful and, like, as literary in style, because Carmen talked about the amazing sort of, like, literary is not a genre, literary is a style. You talked about this at your event, not here. Like, literary is a style, not a genre, right? The genre is realism. You can write literary speculative fiction in that high art style, right? But if your marketing department is like, you wrote a book about a haunted house, then you get put in the horror section. Which is sort of a weird intersection of, like, how critics and artists think about what they're making or criticizing and, like, how we actually sell it.
It's funny that you mentioned that just because, like, I'm thinking of the example of, like, Mother.
Okay.
That is marketed as, like, a typical horror movie. And I remember even sitting in the theater with, like, people were watching, I could tell that they were like, what the hell is this? Like, they were just not. So, yeah, I get what you mean.
I think that happened with The Witch too. Like, I saw The Witch in a theater with, like, one other woman, and she was so angry. Like, at the end of the, like, the movie ended, and she was like, "What is that? What?" And she, like, got up and, like, left, and she was just confused and mad. And yeah, no, I feel like the gap between marketing and art is, like, really. I feel like it's like an entire panel in and of itself of, like, how that can really. And as any writer who's published a book through a publisher, like, has an experience of, like, trying to have this conversation about, like, where does my book appear and how does my book get given out to critic or to reviewers, to things.
Can ruin, like, if you're expecting something and you get something else, you're like, I hate that, when you might have loved it if it had presented to you, like, another way.
We have time for one more question over here.
I'm so glad that high art and low art was brought up, because I've been sitting with that question since we all started. And I'm so glad you mentioned Cormac McCarthy. And I'm wondering what makes high art is the inspiration behind a story. And I was lucky enough to see his one interview that he's ever given. And for The Road, he told the background story, how he has he's older and he has a young child. And he and his son were traveling on the road, on a trip. And they were in a motel, and his son was sleeping in one of the beds. And he looked out at this vast landscape outside of the motel. And he looked at his child, and he looked at the landscape, and he said to himself, what if? And for all of you who read The Road, it's about the end of civilization. What if? And to me, that was high art. And maybe it's the inspiration behind a story that makes it high art.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Their books are for sale back there, so if you would like, you should pick a copy up. Maybe they'll sign it for you.
That hardback of Amberlough is a limited edition now. They're not printing any more hardbacks.
Oh, so pick that up.
But it comes out in paperback, and it's going to be a beautiful paperback.
And my novel, The Art of Starving, is way cheaper back there than it is anywhere else in the world. So, just saying.